Are you looking to sharpen your budgeting skills? You're in the right place. Welcome to the Budget Couple Podcast, where we talk about life, family, and how to afford it. And now, the Budget Couple themselves, Nate and Danielle.
Welcome to the Budget Couple Podcast. I'm Nate.
And I'm Danielle.
And this week, we're going to be responding to a listener question about travel. But before we get into that, we just want to encourage you, if you do have any questions for us, please send it over to our website at budgetcouple.com. Click on that contact form, and we'll be happy to answer that question as quickly as possible. The last 2 episodes have been brought to you by people who have sent us questions. So we really appreciate it, and we have several others in the lineup ready to go. Also, one more thing before we dive into today's content. If you could review the show on Apple Podcasts or your podcast player of choice, it really helps grow the show and bring a larger audience to us, which hopefully helps us bring you a better show. With that said, let's go on to today's listener question.
So I'm probably going to be doing a lot of the talking today because
100%.
This is one of my top subjects that I love to talk about. So we have actually a listener that asked us to go into a bit more detail about travel budgeting and just travel planning and in general. And so I'll just say up front, we do have another travel episode, and it's episode 10.
That's correct.
So if you want to hear more, you can go back and listen to that one as well. I'll pull a little bit here and there from that one, but I've also added to it as well. So start off with the question, they say, we love to travel and are looking for ways to cut costs so we can spread our budget out over more trips. Just as examples, could you talk about eating, dining, car rentals, airfares, entrance fees to museums and landmarks, hotels, and other sorts of things? So that's a great question, and I was happy to dig into this a little bit and think through it. Sometimes I feel like some of my planning is more like just intuitive to me, and I don't really think of it as tips and tricks, but it was nice to be able to put it down on paper.
Yeah, and it's also interesting that we got this because we just booked our airfare for our summer vacation that we're taking this year. So it's kind of like a timely question because we've been looking at this stuff pretty intensely over the past couple weeks and months. Or should I say, Danielle's been looking at this stuff pretty intensely.
I'm already planning 2020 trip, so... So we are going on a trip this summer, and we'll be taking our son along. And if you've been listening, we did take him to Disney last year, but this will be the first time that we've really taken him on a trip that's not all about him. So we'll see how it goes.
Fingers crossed.
So to start off, I'll just say that we're not super cheap on trips, particularly now that we're a little bit older and have a little extra cash to spare. I don't go crazy with trying to save money every single angle. But like, for instance, we don't go to grocery stores and eat and cook our meals, every single one of our meals at least. And so we do tend to splurge and go out to eat more on vacation. But
we also don't eat out for every meal, which is a distinction.
And also we will splurge and go to expensive museums, or, we're not going to necessarily choose between two museums or two like landmarks. We'll just go ahead and do both because, how often are we going to be there? But I also don't like to spend money carelessly. So I do think about a few different things while I'm planning the trip.
Yeah, I think the theme of what we do is that we plan our time and use our budget appropriately to get to where we want to go so that we can see everything we want to see and really try to get bang for our buck. Yep.
So to start us off, you asked first about flights. I tend to like to book my flights, or at least start looking heavily before I ever book a hotel, because then you have more flexibility in the timeline for your flight. So, if you do your hotel first, then you're tied down to those exact days, and you might start looking for your flight and be like, crap, if I had moved it a day or two on either end, it could save me $300 a ticket. So that's a super important thing for me. I always try and focus on the flights first.
And that also gives you an idea of how much the trip is generally going to cost, because if you don't know what flights are, that's generally the most important part is transportation. If you know what that cost is, you can kind of start honing down on the other cost of the trip pretty quickly. But airfare is usually the biggest variable cost in a trip.
Also, if you're able to, I know this isn't always possible, but if you're able to, I try to travel Tuesday through Thursday. So either you leave on a Tuesday through Thursday or you get back on a Tuesday through Thursday. Those, for whatever reason, are usually cheaper than flying on weekends or even Monday and Fridays.
Right. Most business people are flying out on Mondays and they're coming back on Fridays. So Tuesday through Thursday. Now, you could leave on a Tuesday and come back on a Tuesday of the next week, but just as long as it's on Tuesday through Thursdays as your departure and return dates, generally cheaper.
I tend to use Orbitz to search and book most of my flights. This is probably pure habit because I've used Orbitz for so many years.
Yeah, I like flights.google.com, but that's just me.
You can't book on Google Flights, but it is a fun kind of tool that's a little different than any of the Orbitz type sites. So, you might want to go onto Google Flights and look at it. But whatever you do, I always do suggest to, even if you're using Orbitz or something like that, go onto the actual airline site and make sure that you're getting a good deal. Funny enough, our flights that we just booked, I went onto the airline's site right afterwards to make sure. Right afterwards, I forgot to go on first to check and see if we had gotten a good deal, and we actually got it cheaper on the same exact flight, cheaper on Orbitz. So sometimes it works out, but check both just in case. Also, check out budget airlines. So WOW is really good for like Iceland and Europe. If you're coming from the East Coast, I should say, or from the US. Spirit, JetBlue, those sorts of things. So they do nickel and dime you. Yes, you've heard that, and they do. They charge you for everything. But this can actually be a good thing because you get to choose where you spend your money. I kind of like it. It's a really cheap base fare. And then if you want to pay for things like a soda or an extra bag or, your seat location or something, you can pay for that. But if you don't want to, you get to save that money. Because what happens with the other airlines, they might include those things, but you're paying a much higher fee. You're paying a much higher cost. So you're actually getting those things at a higher price, most likely. So just something to think about, depending on how many of those extras you need, you might actually make out better with the budget airlines. So don't shy away from those, essentially. Also, check out different airports around you, if you have that possibility, or around your destination. Even a smaller airport potentially could have a better price. So just look around. And this is probably the most obvious thing, but peak tourist season for whatever your destination is will generally have higher prices. So that's just something you have to deal with. We have to deal with it a lot because we travel in the summer because
I'm a teacher.
Nate's a teacher.
And one other thing I want to mention, and this is kind of true for anything we're going to talk about, I highly suggest using a private browsing mode or something along those lines when you're looking at pricing, because when you go to those websites, they track what you're looking at and generally are going to offer you the lowest price one time and then it will slowly ramp up. But if you go into private browsing mode, they're going to offer you a totally different price, usually lower. So it's a good idea to go through and try to get the lowest price by using private browsing mode so they can't track you quite as well as what they could using normal internet methods like cookies and cache and all that fun stuff.
I still think he's lying about this, but
it's 100% true. It's research-based. It's what they do. They go through and they'll put on a price and then they'll slowly up it so that you buy the ticket because you think it's going to go up. They use basic human psychology and it's really effective because these websites sell a lot of tickets all the time.
So on to car rentals. This was another thing you asked about. I'm not as familiar with this. We don't rent cars all the time or even often maybe because we tend to just focus on public transportation. But we did for our previous trip to Norway and we're going to rent one as well for part of the time in Canada. So just a few things I think about and that I've also heard others think about. Obviously, shop around for all the different companies available there, but make sure you're looking at reviews. Don't necessarily choose the cheapest. Sometimes that can come with fees that you're not expecting. So, read the fine print, read the reviews, make sure that good deal is actually a good deal. And as you're looking around for different companies, go ahead and look outside of the airport, actually. It can actually be cheaper. It's convenient to just pop out of your plane and go right into your rental car, but it might actually be cheaper to take an Uber a couple minutes away, 5 minutes away or whatever, and get a cheaper rental car. Don't buy the extra insurance. Typically, your own car insurance that you have would cover anything that would happen. And Nate tends to, this is something that Nate's really big on. So
yeah, just don't buy any of the extra stuff they offer. Also, don't buy a GPS or rent one. The prices are insane. You can either buy your own GPS for cheaper than the rental fee, or if you have a smartphone, I'm a big Google Maps user, you can download an area. So you can just go on there, highlight an area that you want to have a map for, download it so that you're not using any foreign data fees or anything like that. You have the data on your phone and you're just using GPS, which is totally free. So you can save a lot of money by not getting those things. If you're either traveling to an area you're not familiar with or a foreign country, you can save lots of money not getting those extra pieces.
Also, when you're looking to book, look for coupon codes online. Some places might have deals going on for certain times of the year or certain days of the week. Weirdly enough, sometimes if you add like a 5th day or something, you get a better deal than if you chose 4 days. So just look at those sorts of things.
And almost always you can kind of find a free upgrade coupon. Almost always we've found that, and you get a cheaper car, but you get a better car for the same price as the cheaper car.
And if you have AAA or something like that, you may be able to get a deal with them for certain companies, so don't forget about that. One big thing about when you're booking, and most people already know this, but just to throw this out there, try and return to the same location you picked up at. It can actually up the cost by a lot if you pick up in one city and drop off in another. So always try and drop off at the same location.
And then the final thing is, if you're getting a car, it's going to have gas, and you need to figure out how to get gas in that car before you return it. Generally, gas prices are 2 to 3 times higher if you return it with an empty tank. So very rarely is it going to be cheaper for you to bring the car back with an empty tank. It's almost always, I've never run into a situation where it's been less expensive to bring it back empty. It's always better to bring it back full, and then you don't have to pay a fuel surcharge, which again is 2 to 3 times the price of gas usually. Sometimes it's higher.
And then entrance fees. This is kind of a random thing, but it's actually really important and good you ask about it. There's entrance fees for not just museums, but there's landmarks. There's all sorts of random things that have these sort of fees attached to them. So I would say the first thing to do is do your research in the area you're traveling to. Figure out how many places might have some sort of fee associated with them. And if you have a limited budget for this, just make informed choices. Kind of do some research and figure out what your priorities are. You know, which ones sound the most interesting. You know, maybe you don't want to do all 10 of the sites. Maybe you just, want to do your top 5 or something. So
right. And also don't be deterred by cost. If something has a $50 entrance fee, but you can get an entire day's worth of entertainment out of it, versus something that's a $10 entrance fee, but you only get an hour out of it, the $50 one is the better value. So even though it costs more, you're going to get more ultimate value out of that.
A lot of big cities also have passes. So, they might include 10 different museums and sites in the area, free entrance for the day. They might also include public transportation as well. So these passes are almost always a good deal, at least somewhat. They might not save you a ton, but they are convenient, and they do tend to save you at least a little bit. But do the math first. Add up all the entrance fees and make sure you're actually getting a good deal. It also depends on how long you're there and, how much time you plan on spending in each place.
And finally, make sure you buy these things online ahead of time if possible, because every second you're waiting in line to get a ticket to get into the place is time you're not spending there. And your job when you're on vacation, or at least our job, is to see as much as possible in as little time as possible. So if we're going through and waiting a half hour in line, that's a half hour that we could have been doing something if we would have bought online. And I think this was really true for us in when we went to Europe, particularly Italy. There's a lot of amazing museums that you can buy the entrance fees for online, and then you don't have to wait in a 2 or 3 hour line to get the same thing. You can just walk right in. And then speaking of public transportation, which Danielle mentioned about having everything booked together, you can also look for tourist passes, weekly or daily passes, depending on what's going on. And generally, depending on the size of the city, you can combine subway and bus passes all the way together. So this allows you to use public transportation, which is generally a little bit faster and definitely cheaper than most other versions of taxis or Ubers or anything like that. It also generally takes you into the places that you want to be directly. So it's a nice kind of happy medium of being able to go through and get to know the city, see kind of everything that's going on there, and save some money.
Another thing you asked about was hotels. We tend to do Airbnbs a lot now in the places we go to. We did it in Norway, and we're going to do it again in Canada. It's not for everyone, but they're pretty cheap. They're cheaper than hotels, or at the very least, they offer a wider range of price options than hotels. So most hotels you'll see in a big city, they're all going to be about the same price, whereas Airbnbs, depending on the size you need, the quality, I mean, maybe you want like a entire huge 5,000 square foot house to yourself, or maybe a 1-bedroom apartment is okay. So you have a big range of options there that you don't really get with hotels. Another big perk about Airbnbs is that they tend to include a kitchen, or at least you're sharing a kitchen. So you can save a lot of money by making meals. And like I said before, we'll go out 1 to 2 meals, but we also try and cook in. We'll go to a grocery store and we'll grab a couple things just so that we have maybe cereal in the morning or something like that. So it's a good way to save a little bit of money. And just one more thing about Airbnbs. They do not have to be, it's not some like homestay type of thing where you're living with a family. Tends to be people just renting their home or apartment out. So don't think of it like having to share the space with someone.
Our next suggestion is a lot of things just like flights. Look around at different websites. You can go Orbitz, hotels.com, whatever you're comfortable using. Look around there, but also look at the hotel's actual website to see if they offer any other discounts or compare pricing. So you can get exactly what it is and going through and finding the best price possible. Additionally, just like flights, weekdays are usually cheaper than weekends for hotels. So if you're going through and booking things, just again, check the days because you can save money by moving a flight or a hotel around and really setting everything up perfectly for you.
If you are staying at a hotel, I would always suggest to not eat or drink there. Drink as in alcoholic drinks. It just tends to be so expensive at hotels, especially like a hotel bar. This seems pretty obvious, but if you're doing any sort of room service, that's just going to come at a premium. So if you're trying to save money, I would suggest leaving the hotel for food and drink.
And then our final suggestion is if you're staying somewhere, try to stay outside of the main touristy area. This doesn't mean that you have to stay far away, but you can find a hotel or an Airbnb that's along a main subway or bus line. You're going to get a better price and you're just going to cost yourself a little bit of time. But I think we've always viewed it as you get entrenched in the city a little bit more and get to know the culture of the city a little bit more by staying not only in tourist areas for all of your stay. So if you get to experience a little bit more, it helps you enrich your vacation as far as we're concerned, even though it costs you a little bit of time.
So we've been talking about food a little bit. I just wanted to go back to this and round it out. So speaking of food, we tend to try and eat at least one meal at the hotel or Airbnb, usually breakfast. Sometimes if we can make it back to lunch, we'll do that and we'll buy, some bread or something and do sandwiches. If you are eating out wherever you're at, sometimes certain food is more expensive or cheaper, depending on location. When you're on islands and such, Hawaii or even Alaska, of course, not an island, but far away from everything, food just tends to be more expensive. We also dealt with that in Norway as well. So know your area, know what food you can tend to get cheaper and what's going to be more expensive for you. So if you're along the coast or something, maybe seafood is pretty cheap because it's so readily available. Just like we were saying with hotels, if you get a little bit away from the main tourist areas, you'll probably get more authentic food and you'll almost definitely get cheaper food. So I would suggest, taking that subway a couple stops up or Uber or something and, find something that's not right in the touristy area.
Yeah, excellent suggestions. And then finally, you want to keep track of what you're spending during your trip because your main expenses like your airfare, hotel, car rental, those are most likely all going to be prepaid or you're going to know exactly what the cost is ahead of time. But when you're talking things like food, entrance fees, souvenirs, whatever, keep track of what you're spending. We use a Google Sheet for this. We just kind of pull it up, put the numbers in, so we know exactly what we're spending at all times. And we could tell you generally down to the penny or dollar roughly what exactly we spent on a trip at any single time. So we know exactly what's going on and it allows us to make better choices with our money. Because if we overspent in one area, we're going to pull back a little bit and not maybe go out to a nice dinner. Maybe we'll go to fast food or find something at like a street cart or something like that will cost a little bit less, but still be quality food.
Don't agonize over this, though. We don't want you to have a bad time because you're nickel and diming yourself and trying to record every single thing right in the moment. So speaking of recording things, you can do this on your phone as you go. I don't think we actually do this too often. recording what we do in our daily budget and our daily life. But when we're on vacation, I don't really feel like we write it down on our phone the second we leave a restaurant.
We do when we're in a foreign country just to make sure the charges match up with everything. But when we're in the United States, we generally tend not to do that because we know roughly how much we spend on a general meal. But when we've been in Europe in the past, we used to write down all of the expenses just because we wanted to make sure, not more that we were spending money, but to make sure that we got charged for the right things where we were at.
Yeah, I know. You're making a good point, but at the same time, I feel like we didn't ever record right like as we were leaving a restaurant or something. We tended to either keep the receipts and do it that night in the hotel room, or we would just look at our our credit card statement for that day and record the expenses there. So don't feel like you have to like break up your day by sitting there and recording everything. Just save your receipts and do it in the hotel room each night. Right. Just make sure you're keeping track of how much you're spending so that you're not going crazy over the budget that you had planned for.
Right. And the reason why we really didn't do that much in foreign countries is because, one, we didn't have smartphones for some of our trips to Europe. And two, we didn't want to pay data fees in foreign countries. So keeping a receipt and then just doing it at the hotel when you're connected to Wi-Fi, a lot easier and a lot cheaper.
And the last point here on just spending in general, and I will actually copy this straight from our other episode.
Episode 10.
Yeah, but I thought it was an important thing to reiterate because our listener did mention Europe and overseas travel. I would say get foreign currency out once you get there. Use your ATM card and get the amount you need for the whole trip in just one visit to the ATM. Because if you're doing it in multiple trips, then you're going to be paying fees over and over again. So just do it all at one time, even if you have to go a little high. Also, ask to be charged in the local currency, not the home currency. So you might get asked, do you want this to be charged in XYZ currency, or do you want it to be converted essentially? And always ask to just be charged in whatever the local one is, because that will almost always result in a better exchange rate. If at all possible for you, get a credit card that doesn't charge any foreign transaction fees, and use that for almost all of your expenses. We tend to like to do that. If we're in a foreign country, we have Capital One. They're very, very good with any sort of foreign exchange fees or transactions. So we just don't use our debit card. We just use Capital One. So the last thing we'll say, and sorry, it has gone a bit long, but you got me started talking about travel. So you did it to yourself.
You notice there's a difference when Danielle fully preps the episodes versus when I fully prep them.
I'm a more organized person. Let's just say that.
Let's go through more thorough.
Okay. All right. Thorough.
On topics you're interested in.
So another thing that the listener asked about was some sort of guide or spreadsheet on budgeting for each day of the trip. We don't tend to have this, but like I said, we do have a spreadsheet open that just records all of our daily expenses. But I'll work on this and try and come up with something, and we'll post it on our website. There's no better time than the present, and we have a trip coming up. So hopefully we can, just make this trip kind of an experiment.
And we have free data in Canada, so
Yay.
That's not a concern anymore. But I think that's going to wrap it up for this travel episode. This is like the bonus travel episode compared to what we did in the past. I think this one had a lot of really good information. So thank you, Danielle, for preparing all of this, because this is her wheelhouse. And I actually learned a couple things that she does here, because she does a lot of travel stuff without my knowledge, just kind of doing the background research. She's really good at that stuff. So that's going to wrap it up here. Again, if you have questions for us, please go to our website, budgetcouple.com. Click on the contact form. It will go right to my inbox, and it's working now. And it's clearly working because we keep getting questions. So it's all good there. And again, review us on Apple Podcasts or your podcast player of choice. It really helps grow the show. But with that said, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
Bye, guys.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Budget Couple Podcast with your hosts, Nate and Danielle. For more great content and to stay up to date, visit budgetcouple.com. Make sure to check out the next episode of the Budget Couple Podcast, where we'll talk more about life, family, and how to afford it. We'll catch you next time.